Hello, 2100 students. Today we're going to talk about UDL and differentiated instruction. Now, you've read a few articles, you've watched a few videos, and in this video, I'm just going to pose a few questions, share some of my own experience in the classroom. And then at the end, we're going to talk about our MCA 6 and 7 and what expectations we have for these last few weeks of school. So first, let's dive into differentiated instruction and UDL. You've read a little bit about UDL. Let me over here. The idea here is that we create a curriculum, we create an environment and a culture that accommodates all students and is inclusive. Now, we can do that by creating things that recognize learner differences, that recognize different learner preferences or learning styles. And it can be tricky. So as we look at this graphic, you see that they show learning spaces that accommodate different students, different methods of instruction, different kinds of support. And the one thing that I want you to notice here, my question says, how do we create a curriculum that's flexible and accommodates all learners? The reality is it takes work. And so as we talk about UDL and differentiated instruction, I know there was a video and a reading that talked about how just simply getting to know your students allows you to make changes on the fly to improve student engagement. And that's a big part of this. But there are other things that take a much more concerted effort that you're not going to be perfect at right away. And it's going to take years of practice and refinement. And that's why often more experienced teachers are more impactful teachers, is because they learn from their own experiences and become more accommodating to their students, which is great. There was this idea in one of the articles that to accommodate a student, rather than have him write an essay about earthquakes and tsunamis, he could write an essay about football because he was interested in football. And in this anecdotal example, the student was really excited, wrote about football. This poses a few questions, and many of you recognize this in your reflections. Is it fair to have one student do something that's completely different from someone else? And so I want you to look at this question. Does it matter if an essay is about football or earthquakes if the purpose of the assignment is simply to make a persuasive argument? Well, on the surface, it seems like a no-brainer. If the goal is a persuasive argument, why not let them write about football? But if we're trying to be fair, why not let every student write about something that interests them? Now, that seems like it makes a lot of sense, and that would be a good thing to do because now we have student choice, which is a tenet of UDL, and differentiated instruction. And the engagement should go up, motivation should go up if you let students write about whatever they want. However, this presents some problems on the backside of it. As a teacher, is it harder to grade things if everyone's writing about different things? Yes. Maybe we're actually trying to learn about earthquakes because we're teaching across curriculum. And so we're bringing that social studies or that science unit into what we're doing in language arts. Well, there's some benefits there. If we just let one student do football and everyone else does something else, maybe that's not very fair. But what I have found in my own experience is when you try to make accommodations for your students, whether that be to increase engagement or to teach them at the level they're at, etc. One of the problems is that obviously if everyone in the classroom knew that you were making this special accommodation, there would be some objections and complaints about unfairness, and especially if parents were doing that. However, if you make accommodations all the time, you don't have to broadcast that to everyone in the universe. You just talk to someone and say, hey, let's change this up for you. And then in the same day, go to someone else. Hey, let's change this up for you. If that becomes part of your classroom culture, that's not problematic at all. The idea is we're being flexible here. We're trying to teach our learners. We are differentiating instruction. So it becomes much less problematic the more differentiated instruction that you use in the classroom. All right, so just a few things to think about there. How might a teacher avoid in-class distractions when giving alternate instructions to students? So, I have this because in my face-to-face class, somebody talked about this in their reflection, Julia did. Now, in a classroom, if you break into groups and you have one group working on one set of issues and another group working on something, that can be very problematic, especially if you have 10 different groups and they're all doing separate things. Now, again, if you have a classroom culture of let's break into groups, let's work on our transitions, and you practice that, and maybe there's rewards for smooth transitions, then this isn't as big an issue. However, if this is something that you don't do very often, then you might have to do some training. Hey, we're going to try breaking up into groups today. I'm going to spend most of my time with group B, but group A and C, here are your instructions, and maybe have group leaders or whatever. So there are little things that you can do. Now, when I did this in 5th grade, I broke up into groups quite often, and often it was small groups, 3 or 4. And so they had assigned groups, and it was just part of the culture of our classroom. So it wasn't a big deal at all. However, one thing that I loved that I did at one of my schools is we had tier 2 time, where that was when you would reteach or teach in a different way concepts that were not learned as well as they could have. And so we used evidence-based and data-driven teaching methods in this course, where we would focus on either language arts or math, or we pick something as a grade. And let's use math as an example. So if we did math, everyone in the whole grade would take like a pre-test, and we would sort the results, and then we would make groups among the whole 5th grade of people who needed to work on this concept, people who needed to work on this concept, etc. And then there, of course, would be extension groups that did really well on the pre-assessment, and they were ready to move on to something else. And so then during our tier 2 time, we would move to other classrooms, and one classroom teacher, I would typically work with the learners that were struggling the most, and often had the biggest behavior issues. That seemed to be my strong suit. And so I worked with that group a lot. And we tried really hard not to label it like the beginner group or the you have issues group or anything like that. But obviously the students are going to notice that in this group, they're doing these kinds of things. In this group, they're doing these kinds of things. And so while grouping seems wonderful, there are some social implications. Now, there are things you can do to minimize that. Having a little bit of randomness, or just focusing on one concept and then switching the groups again, making that a regular practice, puts less of a stigma on those that are going to certain groups. Also, in the lowest group, maybe that's the funnest group to be in, and maybe that's where you see the most progress, and so we celebrate progress in that group, and the students can really get behind that if they're being celebrated for the growth that they're showing, not just their competency level. That can go a really long way. So there's a lot you can do with that. We are actually going to do a pivot, and I'm going to walk you through this. Obviously, you're not here to practice with me. I love how my head's on. I don't know how this shows up for you, but on my screen, it shows my head on top of this archer, which is kind of fun. Let's move it over. We're going to practice this. So I'm going to walk you through an example we have. Now, if we look back to our lesson plan, this was the example lesson plan that I gave you several weeks ago. And we look at the action steps, and it has our instructional strategies and our learning activities. And we even have a middle assessment, which is a formative assessment. So in my face-to-face class, I got them into small groups, but we'll just go through this together. If our activity, here our learning activity is a station teaching, where students get a graphic organizer, so they get a worksheet, and on that worksheet, they're supposed to identify individuals involved, the situations they discuss, and other details that they find important. And then they're going to go to either station A or B, and then rotate where they work through these different things. Well, how can we differentiate instruction? So if we have students who are really struggling, maybe they're not ready for this learning activity yet, what might we do? Well, on your SUU lesson plan template, you have this third column, and it says, meet learner differences, identify evidence-based practices to meet the individual or group learner needs, consider their content, process, product, and or environment. So what could we do for the station teaching activity? So over here in this third column, I could type out, and I'm not going to type it, but I'm going to walk you through it. Just type out station teaching activity, and then thinking about that worksheet, Maybe we would have a simplified version of the worksheet. And so I could write that out, have a simplified version of the worksheet for student A and B, which I've identified through my contextual factors, right? So when I looked at my class and the community, maybe there were a few students who just weren't there content-wise yet. Or maybe, like in this example, there are some advanced learners and this isn't enough. So maybe have a bonus problem at the end. So they have station A and B, and then maybe at the end of this graphic organizer, there's a bonus question that says, if you have extra time, also do fill in the blank. So we can make amendments to that handout, and we would write that here in this third column. Now, we can also do this for the think, pair, share. So if we're looking at this instructional strategy, students share what they've learned in each narrative account. So they're doing this in partnerships first. Well, what if you have a student who's so shy and introverted that they just shut down during this time? I actually had a student a few years ago who was mute. He would not speak out loud, but we found that he would write things out. And so I could say for student C, have him write out his ideas to share with his partner. So he would still have a partner. He'd still do the same thing. But the accommodation there would be you could write it out if you didn't want to speak it. And you can make that accommodation for the whole class. Hey guys, if you don't want to actually share it, you can write out your thoughts first and then switch it with each other and read it that way. So I would write down here, think, pair, share. For student A, give him a whiteboard and give him the opportunity to write out his thoughts instead. So we have those two different things. Well, that's what we haven't done yet. As we've done these lesson plans, we did lesson plan 1 or day 1, we did day 2. This is something that is also important to consider. Our contextual factors. If we truly, let me go back, if we truly want to make accommodations here, we have to consider this classroom. So if we revisit from our own unit planner, what class are we targeting? What are the things there? So if we look here and say, hey, English language learners might be an issue. So now let's go back to this and think about English language learners. What if in the think, pair, share, and we have a few students who either speak, let's say, Spanish. If their English is a little shaky, maybe this would be an opportunity to say, pair up student D and student E, who are both Spanish first, and have them share with each other through the prompt. And so we make an accommodation there for those learners. Or we could introduce student choice. You can pair up with anyone in the class. And so we would put that here in this third column. Students can choose their partner for the think, pair, share. So you see that we have a lot of different things. Well, this takes us to, I don't want to talk about it. Yes, I do. I have to back up. Sorry, one more thing. We have to think about assessments. Can you differentiate assessments? So if we come back to this and look at the middle column, we just have these 2 prompts. What are some of the stories of exploration and colonization? What problems do you see? Can we differentiate our instruction and give different prompts to different students? Well, of course we can, but there's some issues when it comes to that. If this was a graded assessment, then there's some issues with equity, right? We can make certain accommodations, but if we gave a completely different assessment, if there's not an IEP or a 504 plan for that student, then we have some equity issues, and that could be really dangerous ground. Now, if you do have an IEP or a 503, or a 504 rather, then you can make those accommodations. And we often do that. Maybe in math, there's questions 1 through 10, but for the student with an IEP, he would just do questions 1 through 4. So you can change your assessment, and we can mark that here in the learner differences. For the assessment, students E and F will only do question 1. They won't do question 2. And so with an IEP, that's totally fine, or with a 504, that's totally fine. Also, if it is just a formative assessment, if the goal is just to help students learn more and understand where they're at, then we can do this all the time with our students. We can make adjustments to our assessments because they're not graded. We're just trying to help them move along. And so we could assign most students to do both questions, but we could say, hey, this group that I've been working with, we're just going to focus on question 1. And so again, you could mark that and learner differences. All right, so now that brings me to MCA 6. We are going to make a pivot. Originally, we were going to do lesson plan day 3 or day 5, but I feel like as I've read over your lesson plans, you've done a good job creating the action steps, and you've done a pretty good job with the assessments and the rubrics. We could probably use a little bit more work there, but what we haven't done at all is differentiated instruction. We haven't done that third column. So what we're going to do for MCA 6 is, instead of just doing one more lesson plan, we're going to shift our focus to differentiating instruction, and we're going to complete that third column for our day 1 lesson plan. So you're going to use your same lesson plan. You're simply going to fill out that third column and talk about how you can differentiate instruction and meet your learners' needs. And I would recommend, before you do this at all, look back at your unit plan to see those contextual factors. What school are you looking at? What are some issues that might come up in that classroom? And then write those in to these needs. So you could say, student A is a English language learner. I'm only going to give her question number 1 instead of question number 1 and 2 on the assessment. And when we do the think, pair, share, I'll pair her up with a Spanish speaker as well. So you see where I'm going with this. This is going to give you a good chance to practice differentiating instruction on your own lesson plan, and that's what we'll be due for Sunday's MCA 6. Let me know if you have any questions or concerns. I will type this up, of course, in the assignment description, and it should be clear as long as you watch this video. All right, I think that's all we want to talk about today. We're down to the last 2 weeks of school. So this week, we're doing these readings on UDL and differentiated instruction. We're doing MCA 6, where you're doing the third column of your day 1 lesson plan. Your final assignment will be next week, where we're going to revise and update our lesson plan according to all the things that we've learned. So you gave us a rough draft a couple months ago. We're going to simply update that, add some more information to it, and I'll give you more details about that next week. And then I'll probably have a final lecture that I'll post, and I'll ask you to do a teacher evaluation and all that stuff too. But we are going to wrap up next week, which is prior to the finals week, because we don't have a final exam. And during that week, I want you to be able to focus on your other final exams. So we're really going to complete all our week, all our materials, all our lectures, all our assignments by the end of next week. So by December 11th, you should be done with this class, which is great. All right. Talk to you soon.